The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. Since November 2013, the U.S. government has declared Boko Haram and its affiliate Ansarud to be foreign terrorist organizations. This supposedly provides further tools with which to fight such organizations and their sponsors. However, an administration that resisted the FTO designation for so long continues to downplay its significance. This hearing is intended to provide information on that reluctance and on obstacles to our effective security and or military assistance to the Nigerian government in its anti-terror fight. Boko Haram is a Nigerian terrorist group whose name in Arabic means people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teaching in jihad. The name Boko Haram is translated from meaning that conventional education, Boko, is forbidden. According to various reports, Boko Haram began in 2003 when about 200 university students and unemployed youth created a camp in Yobe State near the Niger border to withdraw from what they considered to be corrupt, sinful, and unjust Nigerian government, and their community was supposedly founded on Islamic law. The group was then known as the Nigerian Taliban. Violent clashes with Nigerian security forces nearly destroyed the group several times, but its charismatic leader, Mohammed Yusuf, kept the group alive until his death while in police custody in July 2009. Since Yusuf's death, there has been various spokesmen, but one person who is believed to be the nominal leader, Abu Bakr Shekau, is now considered to be the leader. Furthermore, a breakaway group known as Ansarud has appeared on the scene but still coordinates with the original Boko Haram. Because of its repeated attacks against Christian targets during holy days, such as Christmas and Easter, Boko Haram is seen by some as principally an anti-Christian organization. This past year alone, Boko Haram terrorists are believed to have killed more than 1,000 Christians in Nigeria. In fact, it's estimated that more than 60% of Christians killed worldwide because of religious intolerance die in Nigeria. However, it would not be a completely accurate interpretation of the facts to assume that what is happening in Nigeria is just a Muslim-Christian conflict. The kidnapping of nearly 300 Nigerian schoolgirls in Borno State town of Chibok on April 14th has caught the attention, finally, of the international community, albeit 2 weeks after the incident. However, the kidnapping of 8 additional girls after that has been an afterthought, and the kidnapping of another 20 women last week has yet to receive much notice. Prior to the April kidnappings, Boko Haram had generally killed boys but let girls go, warning them to go home and give up their dreams of education. There have been previous incidents, however, in which girls have been kidnapped, though not in large numbers, as in Chibok. Now Boko Haram leaders realize that kidnapping girls gets worldwide publicity. And whether these girls are recovered or not, and God willing they will be, they know that they can do this again and get publicity for their nefarious group. The very news media used to galvanize pressure on Nigeria to obtain freedom of the kidnapped girls is being used by Boko Haram to brag of its ability to disrupt society and taunt Nigerians and their government about their ability to take women and girls away. Several videos, and I've watched them, I'm sure many of you have as well, purportedly of the kidnapped Chibok girls have been released, echoing previously used al-Qaeda tactics in this regard. In the past 2 years, our subcommittee has sent a staff delegation to investigate the Boko Haram threat. And this past September, Greg Simpkins, our subcommittee staff director, and I visited Abuja and Jos to further look into the matter. And frankly, we went to firebombed churches. We met with the Archbishop Kegama, as well as Muslim leaders in Jos, and had very, very eye-opening meetings with the survivors, some of whom had lost limb, certainly had lost loved ones to these firebombings. Just on Monday, I returned from another 4 days in Abuja, where I took time and met with a number of victims who had suffered so much, as well as government leaders. Last week in Abuja, one of the Chibok girls who escaped early on in the ordeal met with our delegation. This brave young woman has suffered so much and was clearly traumatized and in emotional pain. You could hear it in her voice, you could see it in her eyes, as she sat motionless, recounting her story. Yet she spoke of her, not of herself, but of her concern for her friends and her classmates who remain in captivity. I met with a Muslim father of 2 girls abducted from the Chibok school. Fighting back tears, he said the agony was unbearable. Again, this is a Muslim father. The story of his daughters underscored the fact that Boko Haram brutalizes Muslims as well. I also met with another Boko Haram victim, including a Christian mother of 2, whose 2 daughters were abducted back in February of 2012. She told us her husband was shot on the spot. 3 months later, and then they took the 2 daughters and abducted them. And then 3 months later, Boko Haram gunmen returned and asked if her son had converted to Islam. When she said no, they shot him on the spot and killed her son. Again, through her tears, which were almost uncontrollable, she recounted the horror of losing a husband, a son, and having 2 of her daughters kidnapped. We've wasted more than a year not using all of our tools because of the specious argument that doing so would provide publicity to terrorists, and now the administration is downplaying what the FTO designation can indeed accomplish. There must be a robust use of the benefits of this designation if we are to be successful in the battle against terrorism in Nigeria. The 3 criteria for an organization to be declared an FTO: must be a foreign organization, must be engaged in terrorist activity, and must threaten the security of the United States nationals, U.S. national security, or the economic interests of the United States. Clearly, Boko Haram and Ansuru meet the test, and again, that's why I had introduced 3209 last year to urge the administration to declare Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. I want to point out that the meetings with our embassy people were very fruitful, and I want to applaud them for their diligence and for their commitment, both on the intelligence side, on the training side of just a small but not insignificant group of Nigerians, particularly in counterinsurgency, as well as humanitarian efforts that they have embarked upon to try to help those who are suffering so much. Boko Haram and Ansuru does wage tax on the Nigerian government, as we all know, and they also target domestic targets as well. Nevertheless, their actions prove their participation in the global jihad movement that wages violent war worldwide to establish their skewed version of Islam as a prevailing religion globally. Various actions such as the bombing of the UN office way back in 2011 in Abuja, and numerous statements from Boko Haram spokesmen indicate that there is this international intent. And sadly, they are growing. They are not diminishing, they are growing. This international focus has been confirmed by Americans and Nigerian intelligence information. In fact, there was at least 1 American present during the UN bombing in 2011, which we would have hoped the administration would have acknowledged. I and members of our full committee asked that question as recently as the hearing that was held, chaired by Chairman Royce. When then Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson told us in July of 2012 hearing on Nigeria that Boko Haram's attacks were caused mostly by an animus against the Nigerian government, I believe he was wrong in the apportionment of cause and effect. There is a tremendous animus towards the Nigerian government and an effort to embarrass President Jonathan. However, Boko Haram is determined to convert or kill Christians and Muslims that they believe oppose them. Poverty did not create Boko Haram. That would be an insult, I would suggest, respectfully, to the poor. Religious fanaticism, however, is what is underlying and is foundational. Underdevelopment in northern Nigeria provides fodder for a level of discontent with the federal government that provides at least tacit northern support for anyone opposing the government. If northern Nigeria were its own country, it would be among the poorest, least educated, least healthy countries in the entire world. Largely due to the terrorist violence in the north, an estimated 3.3 million Nigerians are displaced, making Nigeria the world's 3rd largest displaced population, behind only Syria and Colombia. Many of those displaced people are farmers, which will certainly disrupt the next harvest and further impoverish Nigeria's suffering people. Yet the blame for perennial lack of development in northern Nigeria should not be heaped on the federal government alone. We have been told that northern states have money for development, and one national legislator from the north acknowledged that each member of Nigeria's parliament has at least $1 million, not Nigerian naira, but Nigerian American dollars equivalent, at his or her disposal for his constituent services. National and state governments in Nigeria have to be pushed to do more on development with money they already have. Finally, it's imperative that we provide the training and support for Nigerians to develop their own capacity to help Nigeria end the Boko Haram threat. The Leahy Law, which forbids U.S. support for military and security forces involved in human rights violations, is seen as an obstacle to some extent to achieving that goal. And I say that as someone who has been very supportive of the Leahy amendments, both for DOD and the State Department over the many years. In this hearing room 15 years ago, when Indonesia was matriculating from Soeharto to Habibie, and we were training the Kopassus group, like an elite group of Indonesians. We had no idea which ones we trained and whether or not they were out there doing urban guerrilla warfare and shooting people in Jakarta when violence erupted there. So there is a need for the Leahy Law, but it has to be very carefully looked at so that fine infantry and soldiers who have the capability to be leaders are not screened out and therefore diminishing the ability of the Nigerians to wage an effective campaign against Boko Haram. I'd like to now yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any opening comments.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. As always, I thank you for your leadership of this committee and for convening today's hearing. I'd also like to thank our distinguished witnesses, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives on the ongoing crisis in northern Nigeria, including an assessment of Boko Haram's recent activities, the U.S., Africa Union, and international efforts to locate the kidnapped girls and mitigate the threat of Boko Haram, and what's ultimately at stake if efforts to quell the group's heinous crimes are not implemented with sufficient resources and all deliberate speed. Since the April 15th kidnapping of nearly 300 girls by armed militants, international attention from both advocates and the international community has been focused on locating the girls, as well as addressing the overarching security challenges caused by Boko Haram. Following President Obama's initial condemnation of the attacks and kidnappings, the U.S. government committed to provide technical and logistical support in the effort to locate the missing girls and support the government of Nigeria in addressing the threat posed by Boko Haram. These efforts began with a joint assessment mission to Nigeria led by the AFRICOM commander, David Rodriguez, and the State Department's Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. Following the assessment, a multidisciplinary U.S. team was deployed to Nigeria, including military and law enforcement personnel capable of sharing with the Nigerians expertise in intelligence, investigations, hostage negotiating, and victim assistance. U.S. military assistance to Nigeria, I understand, is currently focused on military professionalization, peacekeeping support and training, and border and maritime security. This includes providing commercial satellite data and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support to Nigeria's military, and the two governments reached an intelligence sharing agreement in mid-May. To further support this effort, President Obama has deployed approximately 80 U.S. military personnel to neighboring Chad to contribute to the rescue efforts. I know that a lot has been said about the State Department's initial reticence to designate Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization, and as I understand, there were several practical reasons to avoid such a designation in the past. The practical effects of the designation were few, I believe, given limited information suggesting material support for the group from individuals in U.S. jurisdiction. It's my understanding that they have raised most of their money from committing local crimes. Many U.S. officials cautioned also, as the chairman stated, that the FTO designation might actually serve as a recruitment and fundraising tool. Additionally, some global counterterrorism experts have made similar arguments about potential complications related to the FTO designations, suggesting a designation could inadvertently give additional visibility and credibility to a group among international jihadists, or could make the operations of U.S.-based relief agencies in Boko Haram areas more difficult. Given the religious component to the conflicts in northern Nigeria, some experts also cautioned against that designation on the grounds that it could fuel perceptions that the U.S. was taking sides between Muslims and Christians. These and other concerns related to the designation were shared by State Department officials, according to former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Johnny Carson. It should be noted that the FTO designation primarily triggers the freezing of any assets a group might have in U.S. financial institution, bans FTO members' travel to the U.S., and criminalizes transactions with the organization, but does not convey authorization for direct U.S. military action against a terrorist group. Since the designation, however, was made in November of 2013, it's unclear if it's had any impact on Boko Haram's financing, as the extent to which they raise funds from abroad is also unclear. As we prepare to hear from today's witnesses, I hope we can learn critical lessons from the vast experience and use them to move forward to increase support for the most effective measures that bring an end to the scourge of Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. I'm committed to working toward this end and look forward to working with my colleagues in Washington and on the continent to find the most effective and sustainable solutions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bass. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Weber.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm ready to get going.
Okay, Dr. Burr.
We always like to stay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Bass, for calling this timely hearing. Obviously, the grave situation of the 300 girls, nearly 300 girls that were kidnapped near Chibok is something that continues to distress many of us. According to the United Nations, we've seen over 500 schools that have been destroyed in northern Nigeria by Boko Haram, leaving over 15,000 students without access to education, and scores more, thousands more, who are now really fearful about obtaining that education. And it is those acts of terrorism that start to drive folks from just a normal civilized life. We're also, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses on what more we could do to help better support those within Nigeria. But then also, when Ranking Member Bass touched on the sources of funding that are funding Boko Haram. If I read some of the reports from Nigerian troops and so forth, many of them feel as though, again, if I were to trust the reports, that they're under-equipped compared to the Boko Haram troops and forces. So, if they're going into the north and into some of the more difficult terrain to fight against one of the more better-equipped armies in Nigeria. One thing that we could do short of actually sending troops in would be to look for those sources of funding and look for those foreign sources of funding and try to, as effectively as possible, address the sources that are funding the Boko Haram troops and their equipment. In addition, I think I stand with Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass and the members of this subcommittee that we're committed to doing what we can as the people of the United States, working with the international community to continue to aggressively address and fight the terrorism that is coming out of Boko Haram. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Burr, thank you very much. Mrs. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Bass for holding today's hearing on this very important issue. And even though we are working, obviously, together with some of our international partners to secure the return of hundreds of girls kidnapped by Boko Haram to their homes and to their families, we continue to learn of additional heinous acts perpetrated by this terrorist organization. In fact, earlier this week, it was reported that Boko Haram brazenly abducted an additional 20 girls just miles away from the site of the kidnapping in April. This continued terrorization and intimidation is something that no civilized society can tolerate, and certainly we all agree no child in the world should live in fear of being kidnapped, forced into marriage, slavery, or killed solely because they pursue an education or practice of a different religious faith. With an estimated 5,000 people killed by Boko Haram-related violence, it's incredibly important that the international community continue to strongly condemn these actions and remain focused on this terrorist group and work together to hold Boko Haram accountable for these really despicable actions. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about our efforts to respond to the horrific violence of Boko Haram and to doing all that we can to respond to the crisis in northern Nigeria. And thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I yield to my friend, Mr. Stockman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just quick comments in that I thank you for coming before us today. And one of my concerns is, which I expressed to the chairman, is the interpretation of Nigeria on United States efforts. And I would think that we're transparent, but apparently there are some that believe we have ulterior motives for helping. And I can assure you, and as you know, Chris, that Mr. Chairman, that he's sole purpose has been throughout the world is his compassion for others, and that if the leadership or anyone in Nigeria interprets our help or wanting to help as anything other than that, then it's incorrect. And I'm a little bit alarmed at the way it's being portrayed, and I can assure you, from our standpoint, our motives are there to help and not to have a political agenda. The other thing I'm concerned about, which I would like to get answers to, I don't know if it's a proper forum or we have to have a closed hearing, but I'd like to know what kind of weapons. It's my understanding that some of the weapons from Libya have made it into the hands of the terrorists, and if so, how many weapons and how much? Do we have any comprehensive count of what's ended up in their hands and how they're being used? If that's the case, everybody knows Libya was an armed camp. Gaddafi kept many weapons. And for us to sit by and pretend that the terrorists don't have weapons or weapons that could be harmful to Nigeria, I think is a mistake. People say the best way that you can cure alcoholism is by first admitting you're an alcoholic. But if we don't have an understanding and admitting that we have a problem, then we can never cure the problem. And I think we need some honest debate, not criticism. We're not here to criticize, but honest debate on what's going on so we can help. But, Mr. Chairman, I think our intentions here today are to find out how we can help in the proper way and not being offensive, not being a Bigfoot, big print, or sunning truths, but doing something that's real and not interpreted in a negative way. And with that, Chairman, I yield it back.
I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished panel, beginning first with Dr. Peter Pham, who is the director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington. He is the incumbent vice president of the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa, an academic organization which represents more than 1,000 scholars, and is editor-in-chief of the organization's Journal of the Middle East and Africa. Dr. Pham it was the winner of the 2008 Nelson Mandela International Prize for African Security and Development. He has authored half a dozen book chapters concerning Somali piracy, terrorism, and stabilizing fragile states, as well as more than 80 articles in various journals. We'll then hear from Mr. Emmanuel Ogebe, who is the manager of the Justice for Jos project and the Jubilee campaign, and an experienced attorney specializing in international matters focusing on Nigeria. Exiled to the U.S. after becoming a political detainee during the brutal years of Nigeria's military dictatorship, Mr. Ogebe has played a key role in shaping U.S. policy towards Nigeria and its quest for democracy, as experience in managing, designing, and implementing complex international projects and programs in Nigeria. Mr. Ogebe is presently practicing as a legal consultant on Nigeria with the Washington, D.C. Bar. He holds the distinction of being the first specialist on Nigeria out of 100,000 lawyers licensed in Washington, D.C. Then we'll hear from Mr. Anselm Dorne-Barre, John Miller, who served as the chairman of the National Caretaker Committee of the National Union of Ogoni Students, as well as the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, the parent body under which the Ogoni Nonviolent Struggle, Environmental and Social Justice is being carried out. While in a refugee camp in Benin, he founded the National Union of Ogoni Students, where he educated the public on the situation of the Ogoni, as well as drawing attention to the plight of the refugees who were predominantly students and youth. Once resettled in the United States in 1996, he continued his work for the Ogoni people, where his efforts resulted in the resettlement of over 1,000 families in the United States. And then we'll hear from Ambassador Robin Renee Sanders, who is CEO of FEED's Advocacy Initiative and owns FE3DS, both of which craft economic development and business strategies for African countries. In these organizations, she focuses on food security, education, the environment, energy, economics, development, and self-help programs, particularly for small and medium enterprises. Prior to this, she served as U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria and the Republic of Congo, and was the U.S. Permanent Representative to ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. She has served twice as the African Director at the National Security Council at the White House. Very distinguished panel, and we look forward to your insights and recommendations. Dr. Pham.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'd like to thank you not only for the specific opportunity to testify before you today on the subject of the ongoing struggle against Boko Haram, but also thank you for the sustained attention which the Committee on Foreign Affairs, this subcommittee, and other members of the U.S. House have given to this challenge. In its oversight capacity, the House on this issue has been very much ahead of the curve. The very first congressional hearing on Boko Haram in 2011, at which I had the privilege of testifying, at that time, Boko Haram was considered so obscure that all the participants at that event could have been convened in the proverbial broom closet. Sadly, our analysis proved prescient, and rather than fading away, Boko Haram today poses an even greater menace to Nigeria and its people, their neighbors, and indeed the international community as a whole. With your permission, I'll present a summary of my current assessment of Boko Haram and then ask my prepared statement be entered into the record of this hearing.
That objection, your full statement, and that of all the witnesses and any extraneous material you'd like included in the record will be made a part of the record.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, the emergence of Boko Haram cannot be understood without reference to the socio, religious, economic, and political milieu of northern Nigeria, which has been marked by persistent corruption and relatively few improvements in socioeconomic indicators of well-being since the restoration of constitutional order to the country, leaving many communities in the north with the perception that they are falling further behind their counterparts. This has given Boko Haram's message calling for a radical transformation of Nigerian society a wide resonance across the region, even if the tactics the group has adopted are repugnant to the overwhelming majority of Nigerians, irrespective of their ethnic identification or religious affiliation. In this context, the group proved a useful instrument for the ambitions of certain politicians in northeastern Nigeria, including Ali Modu Sharif, who availed himself of the support of the group's leaders and their organization in a successful 2003 bid for the governorship of Borno State, and subsequently appointed a prominent Boko Haram member, Alhaji Bujifoy, to his cabinet as State Commissioner of Religious Affairs during his first term, thus giving the sect access to not only inconsiderable public resources, but public persona. Eventually, the group's relations with state and local authorities soured, tensions escalated, until, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in 2009, security forces moved against the group. Founder Muhammad Yusuf was captured and shot, and not before more than 700 people were killed. Numerous public buildings, including government offices, police stations, schools, and churches were destroyed. With most of its leaders, as well as several prominent backers, dead, the group receded from public attention, and a number of analysts even argued that it was finished. But far from being dead, the group underwent a dramatic transformation with help from foreign jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Al-Shabaab, emerging in what might be described as its version 2.0, adopting one of the most deadly instruments in the jihadist arsenal, the suicide bomb, and through attacks in 2011 on the Nigerian police force and United Nations headquarters in Abuja, demonstrating itself capable of carrying out attacks far from its usual areas of operation. 2012 proved to be another significant milestone in Boko Haram's evolution. While foreign links were a critical part of its ideological and operational shift from version 1.0 to the far more lethal 2.0, the takeover of northern Mali by various Al-Qaeda-linked Islamist militant groups at the end of March 2012 provided a whole new set of opportunities, leading to what I might term version 3.0. During the nearly 10 months in which AQIM and its allies held sway over northern Mali, Boko Haram was able to set up a number of bases in the territory where hundreds of recruits received ideological instruction, weapons, and other training that were subsequently raised its tactical sophistication and operational tempo of Boko Haram's attacks in Nigeria, elevating the group to the level of a full-fledged insurgency. Following the French-led intervention in Mali, the militants, possibly accompanied by a few foreign nationals, returned to northern Nigeria, not only with training and some combat experience in desert warfare, but also vehicles and heavy weapons, including shoulder-fired missiles. Within weeks, Boko Haram fighters were raiding military barracks for even more weapons, staging increasingly bold prison breaks, destroying numerous schools, hospitals, and other government buildings, and engaging the Nigerian military in pitched open battles, and in some cases, totally overrunning border towns. By the middle of 2013, the militants had effectively evicted Nigerian government troops and officials from at least 10 local government areas along the borders of Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, and set themselves up as the de facto authority in the region, in often replacing Nigerian flags with their own banner, taxing and otherwise ordering citizens about, and creating a large area roughly the size of the state of Maryland, within which they operated with even greater impunity. The foreign influence is discernible in the proliferation of the kidnappings for ransom, abductions being almost a signature trait now. The kidnapping victims now have included not only the schoolgirls from Chibok, but previously a French family of 7, subsequently freed after the payment of a ransom of $3 million reportedly, and the release by the Cameroonians of some 16 Boko Haram members, a French priest, 2 Italian priests, a Canadian nun, all of whom were subsequently freed, and more recently 10 Chinese citizens abducted from a work site in northern Cameroon and still missing. Kidnapping for ransom, not only of higher profile foreign nationals, but hundreds of Nigerians whose families have had to offer more modest payments, with most being reported in the order of 10 to 20,000, although more than $250,000 have been paid for more prominent abductees, represent only part of the funding stream for Boko Haram, which is rather diversified. As I previously noted, the group enjoyed a partnership with state and local politicians as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, and thanks to these well-placed supporters, appears to have benefited from public resources. There is reason to believe that even after the uprising and suppression of the group in 2009, some political actors funneled resources to it, albeit for a slightly different calculus than earlier politicians. Some cells have also been accused of carrying out bank robberies and other such, although the extent to which these crimes were committed by and for the benefit of Boko Haram, as opposed to being criminal acts blamed on the group, is subject to some debate. 2 key aspects to bear in mind are that Boko Haram has developed a very diversified and resilient model for supporting itself, and that as it increasingly takes on more and more the character of an insurgency, it can essentially live off the land with very modest additional resources required, both factors rendering efforts to cut off funding particularly challenging. On the other hand, in a region where more than 2/3 of the population lives on less than a US dollar a day, the funding, no matter how modest, can go very far. For example, it's widely known that Boko Haram leaders pay al-Majiri youth literally pennies a day to track and report on troop movements, in some cases to move weapons around. A comprehensive strategy is therefore required to respond to the burgeoning threat posed by Boko Haram, some of the elements of which will include, first, invest in better information and analysis. Secondly, encourage the Nigerian government to deal forthrightly with the threat. Over the years, the somewhat lackadaisical attitude that some senior Nigerian officials have taken toward Boko Haram has been perplexing. It should be noted that not only has the Nigerian military been largely ineffectual in its efforts to contain the insurgency, some military units spearheading the fight against Boko Haram, the Army's 7th Division, are so dysfunctional that just last month that soldiers were reported to have opened fire on their commanding general. Worse still are the instances of actual complicity with the militants, the motivations behind which run the gamut from political opportunism or cynicism to corruption to social, ethnic, and perhaps even familial ties to the militants, and perhaps most concerning of all, ideological sympathy for the extremist agenda. In addition, address legitimate grievances. At the same time, confronting Boko Haram will require that the government carefully measure its response. The government, federal and state, must also better address legitimate grievances which have rendered meaningful segments of the population amenable to the extremist message. Finally, promote specialized training for Nigerian security forces. Undoubtedly, the Nigerian security forces, both military and police, could use assistance in the fight against Boko Haram. However, the need is less a matter of personnel and equipment than training, especially in intelligence and investigations. With a defense budget of approximately $6 billion US, Nigeria does not want for material resources. However, what it does want is lack of maintenance and how to use that equipment. One of the reasons the U.S. recently had to deploy an unmanned aerial vehicle to Chad to overfly northern Nigeria looking for the schoolgirls is because, for want of upkeep, none of the Aerostar tactical drones purchased from Israel by Nigeria several years ago today fly. That being said, tailored efforts to meet vetting requirements stipulated by U.S. law can and should help Nigerian forces strengthen their civil-military affairs capabilities, facilitate interactions between military forces and civilians, and other useful skills. Finally, having just returned a day and a half ago from my second trip in a month to the region, we need to help strengthen regional cooperation and the capacity of Nigeria's neighbors. Boko Haram has used Nigeria's porous borders and the limited capacities of neighboring countries to its advantage. Greater cooperation and intelligence sharing between states in the region needs to be encouraged and facilitated by international partners. In this regard, the regional summit in Paris last month is a step in the right direction. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee, nothing justifies the outrageous kidnapping of the Nigerian schoolgirls, and every realistic effort should be expended to secure their freedom. However, until the profound pathologies which beset the body politic and institutions of Africa's most populous and wealthiest country are addressed, and until Nigeria's international partners move beyond mere rhetorical gestures, it is well nigh inevitable that the tragedy of the Chibok schoolgirls will sadly be repeated many times over, as the kidnappings of some 20 women from a nearby hamlet just days ago underscore. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Pham, thank you very much for your comprehensive testimony. And Mr. Ogebe.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished congressmen. I thank you kindly for once again giving me the opportunity to engage with you on a topic that currently agitates the conscience and the consciousness of many on our globe today. I want to share with you some of the perspectives from our recent visits to Nigeria, and I would ask your indulgence that my full statement be submitted for the record. May I say, sir, that it took the U.S. 25 months after the first 2 Americans were attacked by Boko Haram before the designation of Boko Haram as an FTO occurred. It took the UK 16 months after the first British citizen was killed before the UK designated them. And it took the UN 33 months after the bombing of the UN headquarters in Abuja before they imposed sanctions on Boko Haram. And on June the 2nd, the EU finally designated Boko Haram a terror group, even though the first European citizen was killed 25 months earlier. So this shows that there has been a systematic pattern by the international community to drag their foot on a group that is now recognized to be the second deadliest terror group in the world after the Taliban. May I just say that one of the things we noticed on my recent trip to Nigeria last week is that when I was in Nigeria in April, the average deaths a week were approximately 100. In the 4 days we were in Nigeria last week, the average was 100 a day. And so the world is unanimously against Boko Haram, but Boko Haram is still hurriedly against the world. May I go on to say, with regard to, I have 6 points here with regard to the status of Boko Haram's activities, but I will only mention 2. One of them is the elevated gender-based violence, and that, of course, we've seen with the abduction of the women. But in addition to the abductions, this week we had, for the very first time, a report of a female suicide bomber. So Boko Haram is continuing to evolve its tactics and its horrors. The point number 5 here I will skip to is increased global jihadi ties. And this is important. A British radicalized Nigerian citizen has been implicated in the bombing in Abuja that took almost 100 lives. Now, why this is important is that we have only seen 3 British radicalized Nigerian terrorists undertake attacks. The first attack was against the United States of America when the underpants bomber tried to blow up a Delta plane. The second attack was last year when a British radicalized Nigerian beheaded a British soldier on the street. And then the third one was last month, actually in April, when they attacked a bus station in Nigeria. What this tells us is that Britain is becoming a source, destination, and transit country for terrorists who want to attack in Syria as well as in Nigeria. And this is, I suppose, validates the fact that global terror is working hand in hand to undermine global security. Now, if I may go ahead, I would want to talk about Nigeria's response to the insurgency. And I want to point out, as my colleague already has, that Nigeria's multi-million-dollar CCTV cameras and Nigeria's satellites has dropped out of the sky. So there are so many aspects of the dysfunction and inefficiencies in the system that complicate the threat matrix in Nigeria. I would want to point to point number 4 here, where I talk about inadequate victim relief and psychosocial support. We met with parents of missing kids, and one of them told us how at least 2 parents that he knows have died from the sheer trauma of the not knowing what has happened to their kids. This is just the horror that keeps on giving, if one may use that expression. One of my concerns in trying to work with Nigerian government leaders, especially those working on refugee issues, on why they've not been able to repatriate or assist IDPs, was that, all of that is under the National Security Advisor. And I would think that something as critical as care for citizens and displaced people would not be the forte of the NSA. The NSA has a lot of issues on his hands. And so Nigeria has this unwieldy bureaucracy that makes it not effective. Maybe I should touch on point number 5 with regard to dwindling troop morale. We have heard, of course, of the mutiny that occurred. There were reports yesterday about possible defections to Boko Haram. But it's easy to see that all is not well in the military establishment in Nigeria. I have a subheader here on the international response, and particularly with regard to the U.S. Our findings indicate that the offices in the U.S. Embassy that should liaise with the Nigerian authorities on some of these critical issues are overstretched and understaffed. One of the diplomats expressed that they were sent out of Nigeria to a neighboring country at the critical stage in the investigations concerning the missing girls. And so that has, of course, been a concern for the folks at our embassy who want to work on these issues. Similarly, I am aware that some years ago, the Treasury office that was located in our consulate in Lagos, which is responsible for tracking financial crimes and transfers and things of that nature, was for some reason moved to South Africa. And so you begin to wonder, where are the resources to implement the FTO and to trace terror financing, which is badly needed? I would like to skip, if I may, to point number 3 in my statements. And I'm talking here about the competitive disadvantage the United States has with regard to the aerial surveillance they're currently undertaking in northern Nigeria in the hope of finding the girls. The problem with this is that this is an hour late and $1 short, because what has happened is that Boko Haram began aerial evasion techniques a year and a half ago when they were in northern Mali. They were already conducting drills to evade drones. And so when we come in a year and a half later, they're at least a year and a half ahead of us in that strategy. I would like to draw attention to another, I think for me, the most unsettling point here, which is poor intelligence. We met last week with one of the escaped girls, one of the Chibok girls who escaped from the terrorists. And to our shock and consternation, she had not been interviewed by the Nigerian police. She had not been interviewed by the Nigerian army. And so the impression we have is that for some reason, 2 months after the abduction, the investigations have not been going very well if this key witness has not been interviewed by anyone. I think it was particularly unsettling that it would take an American NGO and an American congressman to find out the facts of what happened to her. And several pieces of information she gave us last week are not even in the public domain. And so I'm concerned that the multidisciplinary force that the US sent in has not been effectively able to work with the fusion centers in Nigeria to show them the basic ropes of how to conduct a missing person investigation. I have several recommendations here, and I'm going to just probably work on two. The first is that the US needs to provide technical assistance to Nigeria to set up a victim compensation fund similar to what we had for 9/11. There does not seem to be a sense of urgency on the Nigerian side to provide relief and systematic assistance to victims of this atrocity. And the United States needs to encourage Nigeria to do that and share with them the model that was used so effectively in 9/11. But let me say here that in addition to sharing with Nigeria that model, the United States has the ability to fund such a victim relief or compensation fund, not by using taxpayers' money, but by releasing Nigerian funds that have been frozen in the United States or that have been subject to assets forfeiture. We think that this is one way to get the Nigerian government not only to do what is right, but to do it in a transparent manner that directly benefits citizens that have been impacted by this situation. I want to give kudos, if I may, to the United States Department. This year, they decided to start funding child terror camps for children who survived terror. And they come to the US to a 9/11 camp and get trauma care. And so this is a notable action by the United States Department that we would like to applaud. Let me maybe throw a challenge now to many Americans, including American congresswomen and American ambassadors who have actually gone to school in Nigeria, and say that this is a time to stand with this country to ensure that there's not a rollback of education. So I prepare to wrap up my remarks. I want to maybe point out that one of the real concerns for us with regard to the battle against Boko Haram is the fact that the United States State Department in particular has continued not to be very frank and truthful about the threats, the goals of the organizations, their objectives, and so on and so forth. I was particularly concerned to read Ambassador Carson saying a couple of weeks ago that Boko Haram does not present a threat to the United States of America today. Let me point out, beyond any doubt, that not only has Boko Haram remained a threat to the US, it has attacked 4 American citizens that I know of. It has attacked an American diplomat working with the United Nations. It has attacked an American diplomat working at the American embassy in Abuja, and it has attacked 2 American charity workers working in northern Nigeria. It beats me why the State Department has not acknowledged that till today. As I wrap up, I do want to point out that the release and the prisoner swap with Sergeant Begdal could potentially have a negative impact on the ability of the Nigerian government to negotiate with the terrorists to free the girls. I think that it presents itself as a victory to the Taliban, and as a result, Boko Haram may decide that, we want bigger stakes to be able to release the girls. I therefore would encourage the U.S. to consider the global ramifications of its dealings with terrorists in that nature before they take them. Because the danger now is that American citizens might become human bitcoins for terror trades around the globe, because the terrorists obviously are in constant touch and in constant leakages around the world. And so these are some of the few quick points I wanted to make. And I wanted to, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of these thoughts with you. And I commend your courage and your lead in taking this issue at a time when no one was paying attention. Thank you.
Mr. Gebbie, thank you very much for your testimony. I just want to note for the record that it was you who set up the meeting for me and my Deputy Chief of Staff to meet with the young 18-year-old survivor of the Chibok abduction. She left before they had even gotten a kilometer away from the school, but still was extraordinarily traumatized. So thank you for setting that up. Mr. John Miller.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, all protocols observed. I thank you, members of your committee, for giving me the opportunity to address you on current developments in Nigeria as it relates to the atrocities of the Boko Haram and how the United States and Nigeria can continue to work together to put an end to the activities of this terrorist group. First, I commend the government and people of the United States for condemning the kidnappings of the Chibok girls and the Obama administration's effort with the Nigerian government to secure the release of these girls. I am very positive that with such collaboration, the Chibok girls will ultimately be reunited with their families. On the current efforts to rescue the abducted Chibok girls, I must emphasize that the United States and other countries involved encourage the Nigerian government to employ every means available at its disposal, including diplomacy, to secure the release. While I continue to maintain my position that no government should negotiate with any terrorist group, I am deeply concerned that if the same principle is adopted in the case of the Chibok girls, their return may not be in the near future. Since the abducted girls are Christians, they risk being killed by the leader of Boko Haram because he knows that the girls remain Christians despite their so-called conversion. He may resort to killing the girls if force is employed in their rescue just to blackmail the government of the United States, Nigeria, and others. In this regard, I commend the efforts of ex-President Olusegun Obasanjo, who has initiated some moves to secure the release of the girls through dialogue and diplomacy. While the United States and the international community's attention is focused on how to secure the release of the abducted Chibok girls, it is important to note that the sophisticated and coordinated attacks that the Boko Haram has carried out after the abduction of the girls show that the organization remains strong, bold, and determined to inflict unimaginable harm and destruction on Nigeria so that the Nigerian state will plunge into total anarchy and chaos, thereby making it ungovernable. As such, the ongoing war against Boko Haram in Nigeria should not be treated with levity or treated as a local Nigerian crisis, but should be elevated to the status of the war against Al-Qaeda. The United States Congress should therefore work closely with the Obama administration to develop comprehensive counterterrorism strategies that will help Nigeria to crush Boko Haram and put an end to the carnage and sufferings of the people of the northeastern part of Nigeria and the neighboring countries of Cameroon, Chad, and Niger Republic. Many terrorism experts and scholars have attributed poverty and underdevelopment in the northeast of Nigeria as the cause of Boko Haram and prescribed provision of job opportunities and development of the region as the solution to the problem. And I partly agree only in the context that poverty and idleness makes youths of the area vulnerable and easy targets for recruitment as Boko Haram operatives. However, I strongly believe that if the youths recruited were not interested in terrorism, they would have resisted, because poverty, underdevelopment, and idleness is not confined only to the northeast region of Nigeria, but visible everywhere in the country, especially in Ogoni and the Niger Delta region. Solving the problem of Boko Haram in Nigeria cannot be achieved without addressing the issue of corruption. While there has been much focus on corruption at the national level of governance in Nigeria and the military, very little attention has been paid to the level of corruption at the state and local government levels in the northeast and other parts of the country. Nigeria operates a federal system of government which shares power between federal, state, and local governments. These states and local governments receive monthly allocations from the federal government and are expected to use the funds to provide basic amenities and develop their states and local governments. However, such funds end up in the private accounts of the state governors and the local government chairmen installed by the governors, resulting in paltry sums of money being spent on programs that have direct impact on the lives of the citizens of the state and local communities. To address the problem of corruption in Nigeria, I propose that the United States government partner with Nigeria to encourage transparency and accountability at all levels of governance. The United States should also, through its Justice Department, investigate and confiscate all funds stolen by those in power at all levels in Nigeria and save in banks in New York, Dubai, London, and so on, and prosecute the culprits. The benefits those corrupt politicians enjoy now, such as sponsoring themselves and their families on limitless trips to the United States and other developed countries to spend holidays, buying expensive cars and luxury houses, educating their children in the best schools and in foreign countries at the expense of the suffering masses, should be stopped forthwith. It is only such decisive steps that will send a clear message to the rulers of Nigeria that the United States is serious about tackling corruption in Nigeria. While a few people may argue that the United States confiscating and arresting corrupt Nigerian politicians anywhere in the world may amount to interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation, I posit that such a step is reasonable and morally justified, especially since corruption breeds discontent and provides a platform for its victims to be easily recruited as agents of terror. Closely related to corruption is the human rights abuses committed by the Nigerian soldiers. It is no secret that Nigerian soldiers torture and commit terrible human rights abuses when deployed to various communities, and such acts discourage local population from cooperating with them and providing intelligence that would have helped in accomplishing their missions. A clear example is the activities of Major Paul Okontimo, the then chairman of the disbanded Rivers State Internal Security Task Force, who committed all sorts of atrocities in Ogoni land during the height of the Ogoni struggle in the 1990s. Despite the extrajudicial killings and crimes against humanity Major Paul Okontimo and his men committed in Ogoni, he remains a free man walking on the streets in Nigeria instead of being locked behind bars. In recent times, several allegations of human rights abuses has been leveled against the soldiers deployed to Northeast to fight the Boko Haram insurgency, and to date, no investigations have been carried out to unveil the truth or otherwise of the allegations. With such negative perception about the soldiers, the citizens find it very difficult to collaborate with them, and without the involvement of the locals who know the Boko Haram operatives, it is very difficult to defeat the terrorist group. To address this issue, the United States government should prevail on Nigeria to set up an independent judicial panel or empower the National Human Rights Commission to investigate such allegations, and any soldiers incriminated be prosecuted so as to serve as a deterrent to others. A case in point is to also influence the Nigerian National Assembly to immediately pass the Enforcement and Punishment of Crimes Against Humanity, War Crimes, Genocide, and Related Offenses Bill of 2012. A copy of the Delta Force documentary on the atrocities in Ogoni by the Rivers State Internal Security Task Force will be tendered. The declaration of Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States government after the initial reluctance is a welcome development because it paves way for the United States government to take various steps, including freezing of bank accounts, deployment of drones, and other assets to fight the terrorists. However, one major step that should be taken that will make the current war against Boko Haram successful is to work with the Nigerian government to identify the sponsors of Boko Haram and bring them to justice. On occasions, notable commanders of the Boko Haram have been apprehended while hiding in the houses of influential politicians without the host politicians being questioned and investigated over their ties with the terrorists arrested. With such developments, civilians who would have provided credible and actionable intelligence are afraid that doing so will put them at risk. And inasmuch as this ugly trend continues, the Boko Haram insurgency will continue. See attached publication of January 15, 2012, titled Unbelievable Christmas Day Bomber Nabbed in Governor's Lodge, and this day publication of 21st October 2012, titled JTF, Boko Haram Member Arrested at Senator's Home. To address this challenge, I urge the Congress to mandate the Justice Department to immediately initiate steps to collaborate with the Nigerian Security and Intelligence Services to investigate, arrest, and prosecute all alleged sponsors of Boko Haram in the United States. Alternatively, the United States should work with the permanent members of the UN Security Council to set up a special terrorism court to try all those arrested for involvement in the activities of Boko Haram in Nigeria. Prosecuting the sponsors and operators of Boko Haram in an international court will send a clear message to members and potential members of the terrorist group that the international community is very serious about bringing them to justice. It is imperative to note that Boko Haram insurgency has both religious and political undertones. The inflammatory and incisive statements made by some Islamic clerics and politicians, especially from the northern part of Nigeria, prior to and after the election of President Goodluck Jonathan in 2011, has also served as an incentive to the insurgents. Shortly after the 2011 presidential election, some notable politicians from the north called on the masses in northern Nigeria to revolt against the newly elected president. With such statements coming from such influential leaders, their supporters subsequently rioted and attacked innocent graduates who were employed by the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, to help conduct the elections. To date, no single individual involved in instigating those unwarranted attacks on innocent graduates who devoted their time and efforts for the service of their country had been brought to justice. It is also crucial to note that the intensification of the attacks by Boko Haram is linked to the forthcoming 2015 general elections, and as such, necessary steps has to be taken by the United States and the international community to ensure that the outcome of the 2015 general elections are devoid of all forms of malpractice, because such will help in maintaining stability in Nigeria. A major step in this direction is to mobilize international observers to ensure that all votes are counted immediately at the polls and at the polling stations in the forthcoming 2015 general elections. As the United States government seeks ways to assist Nigeria in addressing some of our challenges, it is also instructive that both countries identify flashpoints where future crises might erupt and take proactive steps to address them. A clear example of such flashpoints is the case of Ogoni. The Ogoni people since the 1990s had made presentations to the Nigerian government and Shell and the international community to address the environmental challenges caused by reckless oil exploration in the area. To date, nothing has been done about it. A copy of the Ogoni Bill of Rights is being tendered for the records. In August 2011, the United Nations Environment Program released the report of its findings in Ogoni land and submitted a report to President Jonathan, who promised to promptly implement the report. In anticipation of a massive protest by the Ogoni people for failure of the government to implement the report after 1 year, the government in 2012 established Hydrocarbon Pollution and Control Restoration Agency, HYPREP. Despite their reservations, the Ogoni people assured the government and the Shell that they will work with the government to implement the report. However, it is sad to know that to this day, very little attention has been paid to that. However, the United States has a role to play. It should encourage the Nigerian government to address issues that are legitimate and will also be flashpoints in future. A copy of the UNEP report is being tendered for the records. While the UNEP report remains unresolved, hundreds of Ogoni refugees and political asylum seekers remain stranded in the Federal Republic of Benin, living under dehumanizing conditions such as no access to food, medication, education, and the rest. One of the cardinal solutions to the Ogoni problem, as advanced by the Ogoni people, has been to ask the Nigerian government to at least establish a Bori state. To date, not much has been said about that. However, it is difficult to assess that the outcome of the ongoing national conference in Abuja will be helpful given the majority versus minority efforts. Lastly, I will call on the United States government that as a strong partner of Nigeria, they continue to work with the Nigerian government to encourage her address our problems. However, one major step that can be taken is to appoint a special envoy that will work with the U.S.-Niger Binational Commission to coordinate the efforts, because so far it is clear that both the United States has what it's doing on one hand and the Nigerian government on the other hand. Once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Miller. I'd like to now welcome Ambassador Sanders.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the committee, I want to thank you for inviting me here today to testify. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the committee, I want to thank you for inviting me here today to testify before you. I just returned from Nigeria and was in country when the international community became more aware of the horrible kidnapping of 247 girls by Boko Haram on April 14, 2004. Honorable members, you have asked the panel today to discuss the ongoing crisis in Nigeria, and there are several components to this issue. However, my remarks will be based on my knowledge of the region, as I've been in every state in Nigeria and traveled by road from Abuja to Boko Haram's current expanded territory at least 4 times during my tenure there. What I know of Boko Haram before and since its resurgence, noting that it existed since the late 1990s, and my conversations and firsthand observation while on my recent trip. I will address 3 things: the security environment in Boko Haram and areas of possible additional assistance, why Boko Haram was not initially considered an FTO or foreign terrorist organization, and address what I'm hearing on Chibok by my contacts. First, the Nigerian security services in face of Boko Haram. Current Nigerian services have never experienced anything like what they are facing with Boko Haram today. They need to understand that Boko Haram is unlike the Niger Delta conflict, and they need to toss out that playbook as regards to this conflict. Boko Haram is executing asymmetrical warfare, and for the most part, this is outside of the framework of the security forces and their capability to effectively respond. The Nigerian security services have been in recent conflicts, particularly the military, in recent conflicts in northern Mali, including the initial Nigerian force commander. The troops that have also served in Darfur are probably the few that have had the closest experience to asymmetrical warfare, which they are facing now. It is good that Nigeria has accepted international assistance. From my time on the ground, they have always had, I'm talking about the Nigerian military and security services, the following challenges: airlift, and these are also concurrent with my recommendations. Airlift is key to troop rotation. As I heard reports on the ground of PTSD while I was there, it is important because of the distances and tough road travel in the Northeast. And airlift is also important because it will help them react faster to the changing situation on the ground as they try to cover 600,000 square miles of territory, about the size of either Georgia or Wisconsin. The services need additional material, as special mobile communications equipment, vehicles, technology-based bomb detection equipment. From what I saw in many places when I was on the road there, the bomb detection equipment is quite rudimentary, and they certainly need improved control over the porous borders, as we've already heard from my colleagues. They need improved military planning, logistics, equipment, supplies, including sufficient spare parts and fuel. They need to expand its small special forces unit and its 24/7 counterterrorism center, both which were stood up or began to stood up when I was there. They need to establish a satellite CT center closer to the Northeast so information doesn't take so long to reach and be analyzed. They need more rapid response forces, or what we call mobile units, and probably more outposts. Security service personnel and resources are both stretched thin. Realignment is better needed to address the current threat. Improvement in strategic communication and review of existing communication approaches, because what they have now is not working internally or externally with affected communities, particularly with the families. I would suggest a liaison committee led by someone respected for their human rights values that engages with and keeps the families informed, not someone who is a spokesperson used to dealing with the press, but a real advocate for the families. I've traveled through Kano last month by road, and on my way to visit an agricultural project, I did observe a lot of the checkpoints along the way. They're about 30 to 50 kilometers apart. I did not see the ability to communicate between most checkpoints. I understand that in the Northeast, this is more acute as distances between some checkpoints are greater, adding to what we already know, that information is not reacted to in a timely or effective manner. I'm not excusing the poor responses and late reaction date. I'm just providing recommendations from a strategic perspective on things that can be and need to be addressed right now, and I would hope that the assistance packages for Nigeria are including this. I also want to highlight that I think that this is a long war and a long conflict. Nigeria is at the beginning of this, and they have to realize this. This is no longer a localized conflict or insurgency. There is no easy fix, and every attack in response to Boko Haram cannot be viewed as a death knell blow to it. Long-range security framework to terrorist threat is what is needed. The security service need to regroup, reapproach, readdress in order to begin to get off their heels on the defensive and get more on an aggressive offensive footing. Right now, the security services are outgunned and out-strategically played. One thing I also want to put into the mix, on which I'm not sure there's been much focus, is the language differences. Most of the security services in the Northeast are Hausa-speaking, while the majority of the village populations in both Borno and parts of Yobe are Kanuri speakers. Just like the U.S. military had to ramp up on its Arabic speakers for Iraq, the Nigerian military will need to increase its Kanuri speakers as well. My next comment will be an unpopular thing to hear from many, but there are people and elements in the Nigerian military who are committed and serious, but they are under-supported and need resources. This does not dilute the issues of the very real challenges for security forces and reports in the past of corruption and failure to respond. That being said, I had several rank-and-file security service members come up to me on my last trip to say, Madam, you know some of us. You know we are not all bad. We do our jobs for our country. Tell people this, Madam, and I said that I would. I highlight this to underscore who is going to fight this war, who is going to fight this conflict if it's not for the Nigerian security forces along with assistance from the international community. They are the vanguard on this conflict, so we need to help them pull up their bootstraps as an institution, address any challenges that they might have, get it together so that they can effectively fight and fight the security threat they're facing. If this entire security structure becomes demoralized, then who is going to fight this conflict? There have already been reports that one to two incidents where military units allegedly have shown their frustration by shooting at commanders' convoys. One happened when I was there. Relationships with neighbors in terms of sharing intelligence. Neighbors around Nigeria, they need to really work together and begin to really share not only resources, but human intelligence information from villagers in Nigeria as well as neighboring countries. This will be critical elements to fighting this war, this conflict. There has to be better control of the porous borders and cooperation. P-3 surveillance planes can assist with this, but in the end, on-ground human intelligence is going to be key. Boko Haram also has been brutal, so brutal that several villages and markets have completely disappeared. And I really appreciate your comment, Mr. Chairman, about raising the food security issue. Food is becoming scarce as planning and commerce have both dried up. The international community also needs to keep an eye on the food security situation as food shortages could become a real issue down the line. Turning to the question of the designation of Boko Haram as a foreign terrorist organization. As I said earlier, Boko Haram has been around since the late 1990s and was more commonly referred to then and going forward up until about 2003 as the Nigerian Taliban. Prior to the last 4 years, it executed localized sabotages, attacks on police stations, and recruited young people into the group, but no kidnapping at that time. Evidence of some Boko Haram contacts with AQIM started to surface about 9 months after the extrajudicial killing of its then leader, Mohammed Yusuf, and his key lieutenant, Alhaji Buji Fall, in July 2009. This was shared with the then government. I was in Nigeria when Yusuf was captured and killed almost before the cameras by Nigerian police. From early 2010 until August 2011, almost a full year, there was a lull with some small acts and again localized. The morphing of Boko Haram to using Al-Qaeda or AQIM-like tactics to achieve the goal of establishing an Islamic extremist caliphate began really surfacing in mid-2011 with the bombing of the UN headquarters in Abuja. And since then, Boko Haram has continually gotten more expansive in both its reach, brutality, from 2010 to 2014. I will expect disagreement on this, but earlier than August 2011, before it bombed the UN headquarters in Abuja, in my view, Boko Haram would not have met the third leg of the cited FTO designation in the law. It must be a foreign organization, check. It must be engaged in terrorist activity, check. Its terrorist activity or terror must threaten the security of U.S. nationals or national security. That didn't really start to happen until 2011. And the rest of the designation also outlines that you have to have a consistent record over time in order to start making the case for FTO, which began at that time. Chibok, first my heart goes out to the families and the missing girls wherever they might be, as I know they are suffering, scared, and afraid. In Paris Monday, there was a global conference on women, and one of the things that was said there regarding the Chibok girls is that this tragedy is the epitome and dehumanization that girls do not have the right to control their own fate, their own education, and who they might choose to marry. Despite reports out of Nigeria, I do not think, and this is my personal view and assessment from having just been out there, that most of the girls have been in Nigeria for a long time. We have no idea how long the videos being shown were taken, and these terrorist groups learn from each other, and Boko Haram is nothing but strategic. Therefore, I think it is unlikely that most, maybe not all, the girls have been put into smaller groups, taken across the border to Chad or Cameroon or elsewhere, or even if they remain in Nigeria, or some of them do, they're probably in smaller groups or in singular situations. So again, the human intelligence factor, the human, that means everybody working together, sharing on-ground resources is going to be critical to hopefully finding some of them. I also do not want us to forget that from January through March 2014, young girls were being kidnapped, killed, terrorized, and brutalized by Boko Haram. Yesterday, as we've already heard, more than 20 more women were reported kidnapped near Chibok. During January through March 2014, young girls were burned to death in their dorms, others kidnapped, divided up based on their physical maturity level, and those who showed signs of puberty had their throats cut. All of these actions show that Boko Haram Shikeru is acting on one of his stated goals, that he would make the mothers and the daughters of Nigeria suffer in revenge for the capture of Boko Haram family members by Nigerian security forces. I highlight all of these things to underscore that we as the international community cannot be sporadic on these horrible human rights violations and brutality of young girls. We must do all we can to protect the young women in the North. And I have a few recommendations, mostly on the human side of things, just in case the current assistance packages are not including these things. Strongly believe that more trauma and grief counseling for the families and the returned girls must be at the top of the list. I already mentioned the liaison committee by someone respected for their human rights values that can help keep the families informed, and also to avoid the similar tragedy that happened in Malaysia with the families not being informed and not kept in the loop. Ensure that the girls that have returned and their families are protected so they don't become victims again, as I'm sure Boko Haram is watching what happens with them. If we protect their faces, this doesn't mean that Boko Haram elements can't figure out who they are. So we need to be careful with their safety. I also believe that President Jonathan should meet with the families, even if it's not in Chibok. And I'm not making an apples and oranges comparison necessarily, but if the world community can mobilize tons of financial, technical, human resources to find the missing Malaysia plane of 239 people, it can mobilize the same it can mobilize the same to find the 247 girls, no matter in what country they are located. Things such as mistrust among neighboring countries and sharing intelligence information must take a back seat. I do see an array of assistance, but nowhere near the level of mobilization that is probably needed by the entire international community, full-time, all the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Bass and members of the committee.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your, again, comprehensive statement, but also your very comprehensive recommendations as to what should be done. You asked the threshold question, who is going to fight this war? And of course, it's the Nigerian military. I think your point about that Boko Haram is executing asymmetrical warfare, that it, for the most part, is outside of the framework of the security forces, and their capacity to effectively respond is a very profound and necessary statement. People are wondering why the success has not been gleaned by the military. It's because they have been not, you know, I remember in Darfur meeting with troops that have been deployed there as peacekeeping. This isn't a peacekeeping mission. This is, as we all know, a counterinsurgency mission that requires a very, very specialized set of skills and training. And as Dr. Pham pointed out in his testimony, you know, the 650 battalion that's being trained up, while that's good, that certainly is only a drop in the bucket, I would respectfully submit, as to what is necessary. So my first question to the panel would be, as I said in my opening, I'm very much in favor of vetting. As you pointed out, Dr. Pham, in your statement, vetting is important. Tailored efforts that meet the current vetting requirements can help Nigerian forces strengthen their civil military affairs capabilities. But there are some aspects to vetting and the exclusion of certain individuals who are capable and are not human rights abusers that may be excluded because of the current modalities employed by the Leahy Amendment. And I was wondering if any of you, perhaps Ambassador or Dr. Pham or any of our distinguished panelists would like to speak to that. Your point about the command and control and the ability to communicate, Madam Ambassador, is right on. I was there on the ground for 4 days and heard some of the U.S. experts and others not being critical, but being observing what is taking place. The ability to communicate quickly, effectively, with actionable information has to be at the top. Otherwise, Boko Haram is gone. They moved on. They've either abducted or killed in another area, and now they're somewhere else. So I think your point was extremely well taken there. Maybe there's a need, if you would, speak to this as well. $6 billion, I've heard as much as $8 billion for their defense budget. Given their oil reserves and capacity there, money shouldn't be an object to ensuring that there is, for want of a better word, an emergency supplemental of funding to make sure that the bullets, the capabilities are there, including command and control, in a very, very expedited way, so that the troops that are trained, properly vetted, counterinsurgency capacity, can wage a battle. As you pointed out, Madam Ambassador, this is going to be a long-term battle. I think we kid ourselves if we think this is going away anytime soon, especially since it's in ascendancy, not descendancy. So if you could speak to that issue as well. And finally, on the issue of intelligence, I'm very proud of what the United States is doing and very impressed by the capabilities of our men and women who are providing intelligence at the Fusion Center. It is, as you said, Dr. Pham, a very light footprint. It's very important that there not be a huge international presence, the likes of which could be counterproductive, particularly to the propaganda war being waged by Boko Haram. But very, very well-focused capacity assistance and training, it seems to me, ought to be quadrupled, particularly in the area of training. I mean, they have the troops. They have the motivation. They just need a specialized skill that those of us in the West have been fighting, particularly our militaries, for so long in combating al-Qaeda and other types of groups. So if you could speak to those issues, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just briefly address your 3 points and then defer to my my colleagues. On the Lay Amendment, we all share the belief that, by and large, lay law protects U.S. interests in the long term. But you do raise the question of the exclusion of qualified individuals who might be useful in this current fight. I would emphasize, I think, that the lay law, as I understand it, excludes battalion and brigade level units that have been implicated in or at least well documented human rights abuses. In many respects, what is needed in many of these units to raise morale also is not only training, but reforming them in new units that give them a new identity, a new pride. So in a way, I don't want to say the lay law is irrelevant, but in a way, with our workarounds, although already we've vetted 187, I believe, Nigerian military units and 173 police units. So there are actually whole Nigerian units that could receive assistance even now in their current form. But for other units, I think we can get qualified people, and sometimes that's the best thing. We've learned in our own experience of the last decade and some of war, sometimes pulling people from different units and forging them together is the best way to move ahead. So I think there are workarounds. We just need to be creative about it. Secondly, with respect to resources, I would tend to emphasize if we can get more, no puns intended, bang for our buck with Nigeria's neighbors. Nigeria is a wealthy country. It needs training, but it can afford resources. The neighbors are less well off, especially countries that have demonstrated a political will to fight the terrorists, Niger being a good example of that, but simply don't have the resources. And there, because it's a smaller country, smaller military, we can better account for the funding being spent, and the multiplier effect of having them seal their borders, which Boko Haram has been using to crossing Niger, Chad, other countries, might be a better use of our limited resources, and then devote our resources in Nigeria to training rather than material, which Nigerians are more than capable of paying for themselves. And finally, on the intelligence issue, I agree with your assessment on the good that we've done with the small number we've put there, and we certainly could increase that. One thing I would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to raise the fact that we do not yet, after years of constantly talking about this year in, year out, and Ambassador Sanders, I think, will be able to comment on, we have yet to deploy a diplomatic mission north of Abuja. This is an area with arguably the largest Muslim population in all of Africa, larger than even Egypt's population, if you think about the number of Nigerians in the north. We don't have a diplomatic installation. We don't have even the lightest of footprints to build bridges, to gather knowledge of the people, and to build relationships which will help when we have to ramp up in these cases. And we need to revisit this with, I think, far greater urgency than even in the past. Thank you.
Yes, I have a couple of quick points here, sir. And the first is that as we worked on advocacy to bring about the designation, the FTA designation, we found that it was easier to blacklist a foreign army under Leahy than it was to get a designation for a terror organization. And so that was, I thought, ironic. Secondly, the guidelines for appealing an FTA designation are easier than for reversing a blacklist under Leahy. So I think there needs to be some kind of parity between the two, because we need some of these foreign armies to help us with regional security considerations. The second point I wanted to quickly address was military capacity. Nigeria used to have a really outstanding air force, but all the years of military dictatorship saw attrition, internal attrition, as generals, one general after the other, killed off some of the best pilots and so on and so forth they had. So we now see a Nigerian Air Force that is a shell, a real shell of its former self. And last year, Boko Haram attacked an Air Force base and destroyed 5 jets. And the Army's response was, the jets were faulty anyway, so it wasn't a big loss. But what are you doing having 5 broken down jets in your base in the first place? I think the one last point I'll make on this is that part of the problem with the military strategy is that there's so much disinformation that it's difficult to even know where to help them. They're not being truthful about losses, about combat incidents, and so on and so forth. So you don't know what really is going on. And from what we can tell, they're taking a really bad bashing, as the Boko Haram video of the attack on Giwa Barracks shows. They're really getting the short end of the stick in this battle. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Mr. Chairman. I want to start on the intelligence issue because I think we need to have a broader discussion about expanding what we mean by that. Certainly, I'm 100% behind you in terms of the capability of U.S. intelligence. I had the privilege of having access to that, so I do respect that. But I'm actually talking about human intelligence on the ground. Having a way to either better communicate with villagers and locals living in the area so you get a better sense of what's going on, which is why I kind of raised the language issue, because I remember being up there and being with Hausa speakers in terms of even the military and police contingents that were with me, and not being able to communicate once we got outside of Maiduguri with the population outside of the capital, because they weren't speaking the same language. So when you look at some of these outlying areas, I was wondering whether or not, as part of the strategic communication, that needs to be looked at. So, because maybe they're just not being able to communicate with each other. I'm not reducing the issue by saying that, but I think it's an issue that needs to be looked at. We found that for ourselves in Iraq, and I think it may be an issue for the Nigerians to pay attention to. So those two things. In terms of intelligence also, the CT center, which I won't say where it is, but I think they need to really have a satellite center closer to the area of conflict. Because if everything has to come back to where that center is located to be analyzed and reacted to, you are looking at days and sometimes weeks here to do that. So that's a reality that I think, I won't say it's a quick fix, but it's certainly a reality that can address some of the issues. And then in terms of troops, I don't know how many of the troops who served in Darfur and Mali are either being included, maybe they're not even based in the north, I have no idea, but are they in this group that's been vetted that can actually provide some intel in terms of how you deal with asymmetrical warfare to their colleagues on the ground? I think that's a big issue. They have only a small special forces unit, and so maybe that's additional. I think maybe the trainers that we have there now from the U.S. are helping to do that, but their special units need to be expanded, and they have to have more mobile units than they have right now. Transportation from one point to another, I don't know if you've been up there or my colleagues have been up there in recent times, but it is a very, very difficult environment to travel in. So I can't underscore enough the need for equipment, vehicles, and others. On the human rights issue.
Would you yield briefly? Would you encourage the Nigerian government to do an emergency supplemental, as we would do here, as we have done time and again, to appropriate additional funds? Because it seems, I mean, I heard story after story of too little ammunition, too little of everything. And how do you fight a battle or a war when you don't have the capability in terms of munitions?
I have two responses to that. One, I think the money is there and they have enough money to do it. I don't think the money is being deployed properly, and I don't think it's getting to where it needs to be. So you can add more money to the fire, but if it still doesn't get deployed where it needs to be and utilized properly, you're still going to have the same issues. So I would stress deployment and utilization of the resources they have more effectively and more efficiently, and getting to the right people that need to have it. And certainly in the Northeast, they're short on a lot of things, even fuel, to get from one place to another. On the human rights issue, one of the things that I had suggested when I was on the ground recently, not this year, but the end of last year, was really looking at having fast-track military courts on human rights issues, so that there's transparency in the process, that the public knows, the military knows, and there's a sense of of addressing impunity if things do happen in the human rights arena. So that hasn't been done yet, and I still think that that's something that they could do. The neighbors cannot be stressed enough. Their role is extremely important. They don't have the resources, but it's not only just resources, there's a general mistrust in sharing intelligence across countries. And I think that somehow maybe we can play a facilitating role in helping address that mistrust, because without that kind of coordination, cooperation, and communication, then all the human intelligence stuff that we're talking about, even hard intelligence, is not going to be useful if it's not responded to in an effective and coordinated manner. On FTO, I can just say this. I think that and then I'll go back to Leahy, but on FTO, I would encourage, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bass, that your committees and your staff take a look at the details of the FTO. We are in a completely new global environment. When you look at the date on some of these updates, 1985, 1988, 1989, you know, we are in a completely different global world today than we were at that time, and we have I won't say a Cold War element here because it's not, the dates don't correspond, but in a way it's structured that way. And in the end, I think that a closer look needs to be taken for the FTO so that we don't wait 12 months, 25 months, 33 months to designate an organization that needs to be designated as such. So I would encourage that. I've already talked about the equipment issue. On presence in the North, that is really a thorn in my side, I must say, and I presume that my colleagues who are on the ground there feel the same. We have tried, I know, to establish a presence in the North for several times. When I was there was an administrative decision, at least. We didn't get to implementation phase to try to have a small consulate in Kano. There were a lot of administrative challenges to executing on the ground, most of which was security. How do we protect the Americans that would be there? What we did have there in Kano, in Bauchi, and in Borno, and I went to all three sites, we did have an American corner presence. I don't think because of the state of emergency that we can have those anymore and the security situation. So the diplomatic issue, fundamentally and theoretically is absolutely on target. The reality, though, makes it a challenge for us as a government. How do we protect the people that are there, and how can they effectively do their jobs if they're then hunkered down and can't get out? So that's a reality that we'd have to talk about because American lives come first. On the Leahy issue, Leahy amendment on vetting, I think that we can find qualified people and elements. As I said, I know a lot of them personally. I've worked with them firsthand. I went to every single military exercise that I could get to really have a better sense of what the capability was and the environment was. And as I said, there are a lot of good, dynamic people in the Nigerian security services. I had 2 military police responsible for my protection when I was there for 3 years, top-notch guys. So I would argue that, let's, walk the fine line that we have to walk on this, provide the training and assistance that we need to provide to the elements that we are sure of that have not been implicated in human rights violation. If they can stand up a fast-track military court to be able to address those other issues, let's get that done. And I think that I've addressed all of your initial questions.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank all of the panelists. I think this has been an exceptional hearing, and I appreciate your information and your input and your recommendations. I just had a couple of questions. Reports suggest that the Nigerian government has been hesitant to accept U.S. assistance, and as a matter of fact, my understanding is we were trying to provide that assistance right away, and there was reluctance on their part. And I wanted to know if members of the panel could respond to that and maybe provide us some kind of insight. I'd also like to know if that has changed. In my comments, I did go through several ways that I know our government has been involved, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's all that welcomed. And Ambassador Sanders, and this also, applies to other members of the panel too, I wanted to know what you feel specifically, especially in the North, are the most pressing concerns. I know it's poverty, but, what exactly does that mean? And I did understand that there was a Nigerian entrepreneur who said that he's going to go up to the North and provide some jobs. I don't know how specific or realistic that is. And I would, agree with the panelists. It might have been Mr. Miller, I'm not sure, who said that it's not just about poverty, but poverty does set the stage. When people are desperate, they will, join forces like Boko Haram. So anyway, I wanted to know about that. And this is just a side note, but Dr. Pham, you said that the Nigerians had drones from the Israelis, but the drones don't fly, and I just wanted you to finish that. You made that comment, but I wanted you to explain about that. Thank you. You could start,
Okay.
Dr. Pham.
Okay. Thank you, Ranking Member Bass. I'll start with the last one on the drones. 2 years ago in the ramp-up after the big wave of attacks of 2011, Nigeria purchased a number of drones from Israel, Aerostar drones. They also purchased, and the government allocated reportedly $20 million for a maintenance contract. The Israeli firm that was supposed to maintain the drones came, set up shop. They never got paid. And so after a few months of this, although the money was allocated, they closed up shop and went away. They're in business to make money. They went away, and then no one picked up the slack. The money was allocated, and the good Lord knows where the money went. And so 2 years later, when the drones are needed, not being maintained for 2 years, they don't fly, and that's just one anecdote, and one could find others. A couple years ago, some of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council and the African Center did an analysis of the Nigerian fleet and how many of the vessels listed in the battle order were in dry dock, and it was a good 2/3 of the fleet. And so it's a systematic problem. It's not going to be solved overnight, and it doesn't reflect on individuals who really want to serve their country, but it is a systematic issue. But they do have the drones. That's the open source bit of information out there. They have the drones, but none of them fly.
Thank you. Would other witnesses like to respond to some of the other issues I raised?
Well, on the issue of the North and what should be done, it's not just an issue of underdevelopment and poverty, because like I said in my presentation, poverty is all over the place. If you go to the Niger Delta and look at the landscape, you will agree that the situation in the North is not as grave as the Niger Delta. And even when the Niger Deltas took up arms, when they were told, look, enough is enough, they listened. So to tell me that poverty is responsible for the situation in the North, that's not accurate. It has to be looked at from the lens of politics. The belief has been that it is a North-South divide when it comes to political offices. When a president comes from the North, obviously power changes hand, and when Yar'Adua came, unfortunately he passed, power went to Goodluck Jonathan from the Niger Delta. And the belief was that when Jonathan completes his 4 years, it should go back to the North. With the belief that Jonathan is about to complete his 4 years and go for a second term, that's one of the reasons why you see the intensification of the attacks. So this issue has to be addressed, that as far as leadership in Nigeria is concerned, it is open to all, not just a matter of one zone producing the leader of the country, and then for some reason, when the other one is unable to produce, it now brings up issues, and then there is crisis. It is also clear that corruption, until we deal with the issue of corruption, no matter the human intelligence we have and all that, corruption pervades every aspect. Look at the case of the military. How can you have a functional military when the budget of the military is unbelievable? But where are the weapons to show that the budget actually was spent on the weapons.
Well,
They are not there.
and one of the reasons why I asked you the question was I was just trying to identify some solutions.
Right. So what should be done is this. The U.S. government and the international community needs to sit down with the leadership of Nigeria and make it imperative to them that this is the threat that corruption is having on the situation in the country.
So
Because-
the first question I was asking was about Nigerians' reluctance to accept U.S. assistance.
that
So
is
within
not-
that context,
Okay.
how can we do what you just said?
Okay, I read in the papers, and I'm also going to bring you back to the issue of culture and also ethnicity as also part of it. When the U.S. responded that they were going to give the Nigerian government drones and all that, everybody welcomed it. I issued a statement. It was just a few northern politicians who opposed it. And the reason for opposing it is that they see it as a way of empowering Jonathan. And if those assistance are accepted, it will certainly expose them, who are the sponsors of Boko Haram. So in a way, they don't want anything that will give opportunity for the security operatives to unveil the real sponsors of Boko Haram. That's why no matter what you do, they will always criticize that. The best thing that should be done is to come out clearly and say, as long as this is terrorism, if you are implicated, you'll be picked up. This is a national security issue. It has nothing to do with politics. If you even look at the arguments over whether the Chibok girls were abducted or not, you will see that it's a matter of politics. The Borno government is saying that the federal government is not doing enough. The federal government is saying, no, you are not doing enough. You will see that there is no unity amongst the levels of government. And when it comes to terrorism, the safety of lives and properties of the citizen comes first.
Okay. Okay, maybe I can hear from the other two witnesses.
Yes, I was going to say that part of the reluctance of Nigeria in accepting foreign assistance was this whole persona of, oh, you know, big brother Africa.
Right.
You know, we are the world, we take care of everyone, no one takes care of us. So that clearly was a constraint. But talking to some of the military sources in Nigeria, for example, regarding the FTO, they did hint that there was a reluctance by politicians to have, you know, finances being tracked and all of that. And so that may have been why, you know, they were not gung-ho about FTO designation themselves. But I think that Nigeria is now at the point where they realize they can't go it alone. And if this is any encouragement to you, some of the families we met last week told us how they were contributing $70,000. These are poor peasant families, but a witch doctor in Cameroon had apparently offered to help them bring back their girls. And these poor farmers were trying to raise that money. And here's what they told us. They said, when we heard in the news that the Americans were coming, we decided not to raise that money.
Oh,
And that was, for me, very uplifting.
right.
And I think it illustrates the point that they were retreating back into the dark ages
Right,
because their
right.
government had failed.
Right.
And then they saw a glimmer of hope from the world. And that is why the majority of them are excited about America's intervention.
Okay, thank you. Let me go on to Ambassador Sanders.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bass. You're absolutely right in terms of there being resistance to receiving U.S. military training more than anything else, not necessarily equipment, but really sort of the training. And I saw that firsthand when I was on the ground. I spent my first 12 months or 18 months fighting back their concerns about AFRICOM. If you put things back in context, you know, do a little bit of history on this issue, AFRICOM had really just been stood up a couple of years before, and there was this phobia about AFRICOM on the continent. When I landed in Nigeria, the phobia on AFRICOM was at an all-time high, not wanting a military footprint on the continent, all of those things that we've now seen kind of dissipate. And I've always been a big advocate of AFRICOM in terms of its capability for training. the intel it brings to the table, and everything else. And as I said, my team and I worked really hard to change that dynamic around in Nigeria. So yes, you're absolutely right. There was that resistance early on, and maybe things would have been different. Now I see a huge change in that. As you said, the AFRICOM commander was just there. I know he went to several locations, not just in the capital, and I think that that is a real turning point for Nigeria. But let me just put one word of caution on the table, though. As we move forward, now that we have this open door and there is a desire for our assistance and our help, I also think that we have to remember that this is a military that thinks of itself as a professional military. It has served in peacekeeping operations probably more than any other African country in the world. They were the top peacekeepers from the African continent. Their force commanders were in Mali. Their force commanders were in Darfur. They were in Liberia, for instance. So we have to keep that in mind as we go in and try to help them and assist them. And keep that in mind that we can't also add to the demoralization that they may be feeling now. We need to be going in with the best foot forward, which I'm sure our guys are doing, but I just want to put that out there for the record. In terms of the poverty issue, definitely that's a feeder issue. It's not, I would say, I was always in the camp of saying that I didn't see poverty being the driver. I actually saw, when I was up there, I had a session with religious leaders. I had a session with students from Maiduguri University my last time up there before I left. And then I did a open town hall in downtown Maiduguri, one of the toughest environments I have ever had to speak in. And what I walked away with from that encounter, at least the last one, which is very tough, I mean, very aggressive, very hostile to the U.S., all of those things, I walked away saying that this is really more about a clash of civilizations, really a different world perception of where people, where the fundamentalist groups want to take their country. So how do we address that? What I saw this last time was a slight change in that, because Boko Haram has been so brutal that the recruitment and feeder issues have diminished somewhat in their ability to attract people to their entity. And that, to me, is a good sign that maybe we as the international community can capitalize on by then addressing the sectoral development issues, because the attraction for Boko Haram, I think, has been diminished quite significantly because of their brutality. I was at one session with a group of students at University of Maiduguri, and I'll never forget this young woman. And she stood up and said, why doesn't the U.S. Like people from the Islamic faith? I mean, so there was that initial sense, I thought, from a lot of young people in that part of the region. I don't see that as much now because of the brutality of Boko Haram. So I think we have an opportunity here to capitalize on that changing tide that has happened on the ground and really come in with some fundamental development tools to address education, health care, but more importantly, potable water and sanitation, I would put at the top of the list, as well as really providing an enabling environment for people to live their lives in quality and in peace.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady Jackson Lee from Texas is recognized. You bet. Oh, you bet.
Let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesies to a member of the Judiciary Committee and Homeland Security Committee and a former member of this committee that has had a very strong commitment to the continent and, of course, to these issues, to our children and to this crisis dealing with Boko Haram. Let me thank each of the witnesses and take note of Ambassador Sanders for her service to the country, and to Jubilee for its very in-depth, persistent presence in some of the more difficult areas. So I'm going to start with Mr. Fan on the presence or non-presence of the African Union, and whether or not they can pose an effective catalyst for a concerted, purposeful action against Boko Haram. Do they have the necessary assets to view this as an attack on Africa and to be able to be helpful?
Thank you, Congressman Jackson-Lee, for that question. The African Union, first, let me begin by saying it is an attack. Boko Haram is a threat not just to Nigeria, but to Africa itself.
Absolutely.
And in that respect, it should be, and it ought to be, a concern for the African Union as a whole. That being said, the African Union faces several constraints, which we have to be realistic about what it can do in this particular situation. The first constraint is the reluctance still, as Ambassador Sanders just mentioned in her response to the ranking member, of Nigeria to, it's going down, but there's still a residual resistance to outside, if you will, interference, which the African Union would have to overcome. Secondly, the African Union, unfortunately, its counterterrorism center is based in Algiers, and part of that it enters into the very murky and complex politics of Algeria, its relationship with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, its relationships with Boko Haram. It gets into a whole bunch of weeds. So although the legitimacy of the African Union should be brought into play, its condemnation, its convening power, in reality, we're facing a situation that requires immediate action and resources, which by the time the African Union got it all together, it's definitely way too late for the poor girls from Chibok and for the current effort. So for now, we should use what we can from the African Union, use its convening power, its moral authority, but recognize there are very severe institutional dynamics which limit its ability to act effectively in this particular situation.
I don't want to pursue that frailty, but that disappoints me greatly. The African Union, as I understand it, based still in Ethiopia, is it, has military resources and assets, as I thought. And I'm just shocked that this is not a potent enough issue that they cannot be engaged. I'm not going to ask you to respond, but I'm just going to say on the record, I'm disappointed, and I hope they'll have an opportunity to meet some of their representatives here. I know we've met some of them in Africa, but I'm just shocked, because some of us as members of Congress have indicated that that would be a good partnership to look at it from the African perspective. There's got to be some military force that has a concerted effort, and I heard Ambassador Sanders' comments about the resources that Nigeria has, and I also heard your comments, tragically, that this has been going on since the 1990s. So it is now mushroomed, and it is now at a point where it's going to be that much more difficult to contain it. But contain it we must. That's my view of it. Contain it we must, and we must use not only the resources that we did looking for the Malaysian flight, which I truly believe we should as well. This is too rich a world, even with the developing nations, but I frankly believe that we should use the resources that we're using collectively as a world family against Al-Qaeda. Because when you hear the word Al-Qaeda, hair stands on the top of everyone's head, and every resource that they have is thrown at it. And in this instance, not only are we missing world support, but we're missing world resources. Let me ask Mr. Ogabe, thank you for being here representing Jubilee. Can you speak to the religious crisis that we're facing, and is there any way to part the waters on the religious crisis? Because if we are to go to, am I pronouncing it right, Kano, where it is the sort of the centerpiece, Does someone get on a van and come with a peace flag, a white flag, and say, let's bring everybody together? Is that a reality at this point in time? And I might just want to put on the record, Mr. Chairman, I am aghast, and I'm going to get to the two other witnesses, that the loose existence of official military garb, uniforms, can be co-opted, put on terrorists, and innocent persons in a church literally shot down in cold blood. And the worst of it is that they were receiving these individuals, welcoming them as people who were coming to help them, save them, protect them. Emmanuel?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Lee. Yes, the religious motivations of Boko Haram are explicit, and clearly they have conducted what I consider a pre-genocide on the Christian minorities of northern Nigeria. Now, speaking particularly with regard to their attacks on religious communities, last year they attacked over 60 churches, and in the same time frame they attacked about 2 to 3 mosques. So overwhelmingly, their focus is on Christian targets, government targets, and occasionally they attack Muslim groups that cooperate with the military authorities. Now, that said, the concern that you make with regard to their access to military uniforms is very valid. And this really has created a credibility crisis for the genuine security forces, because you have people showing up in uniforms and cutting away girls whom they say they're going to protect. And that had just happened again last week when they showed up in the church and rounded people up and said, we're here to protect you, and massacred scores of people in that village. Some of our findings is that at one point, the Nigerian Chief of Staff, in an effort to boost recruitment of Northerners into the army, enrolled a lot of people. There were mass recruitments. And the records indicate that the night before graduation, after all of the training, a lot of these people deserted. So they deserted with knowledge and tactics of the Nigerian military, and they deserted with uniforms. So when you watch some of the videos of their attacks, you can see that these are very well-trained people who know the ropes of the Nigerian military's tactics. Secondly, and this is sad, this goes to the issue of corruption again. For many people in the security forces, they have to buy some of their own equipment, including their own guns and uniforms. And so if you open source uniforms and guns and bullets, you will clearly have a problem of proliferation falling into bad hands.
And you may have a problem, if Chairman is kind enough to indulge me, I'm sorry if I can continue. You may have a proliferation of mismatched uniforms, not letting the people know what is what.
Yeah.
Let me just pose this question. I want to get to the other witnesses because maybe I'm being idealistic. Can we, first of all, would anyone listen to a ceasefire? Would anyone listen to the carrying of a white flag to go into the region and say, I want to sit down, and I see a smile, I want to sit down and begin to at least talk about a ceasefire and a cessation of the violence. Then begin to talk about the issues, because in the testimony that has been given, in the questionings of the ranking member, there was the issues of extreme poverty, but there's also issues that the country itself has enormous wealth, but we know that the northern region is enormously impoverished, which may have been the genesis of a lot of this. Is there any hope of some kind of effort like that, and who would be the leaders of that effort?
Well, with regard to the poverty, let me quickly polish that off. Boko Haram is killing Christians within their community who are as poor as them, or in some cases even poorer, because those Christians tend to be denied access to government services because they're religious minorities. The Christians could very well be terrorists as well if poverty was the simple reason or rationale for this, and they're not doing that. With regard to the idea of a ceasefire, Boko Haram does not respect, humanitarian corridors or any of the conventions that civilized people respect in combat. For example, allowing medics to come in, allowing relief to come in. They have actually gone out of their way to kill medical workers. So they may not be open to moral suasion from any source. That said, at this point, because of the world headlines, the global spotlight on them, they may be open to approach. I will say that we have contacts who communicate with Boko Haram, and I tried to find out while I was out there last week whether they were open to talking, and apparently that channel has been silent for a while. But I think, Congresswoman, if you wanted to lead that effort, we would be solidly behind you. But I can't think of anyone who would lead the charge as far as trying to broker a ceasefire. But certainly with the media headlights, which they clearly like, they're media savvy, there may be a window to actually have a dialogue with them.
Let me ask, well, thank you. So on this side of the table, let me now call for a ceasefire. Let me join with my colleagues here, Chairman Smith, and the members of this very esteemed committee, and therefore say that we want a ceasefire, we want to save lives. And I know there are many experts at this table, but if they can hear the sound of our voices, we've just asked for a ceasefire, and I'm not taking this lightly. And this is baffling and outrageous. But I do believe that there has to be some moment where we can find a way to save these girls. May I ask the last two witnesses this question, and Ambassador Sanders, you in particular who've just come back. For those of us who may be headed in that direction, what should we be looking for? What should we see? What should we ask? To Mr. John Miller, we thank you for your service. Again, I'm going to ask you the question about any hope for a ceasefire from a humanitarian perspective that then gives us the opportunity to bring these girls back. We are hashtagging it. We are press conferencing it. These girls are still scattered, still away from their families, and still frightened. And so I'd ask you that. I'm going to go to Ambassador Sanders first, so what we should be focused on, Ambassador.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I wanted to just briefly say something on the AU, and I'll go right to your questions. But I just wanted to let you know that the ECOWAS countries have trained together before and have worked together before in conflicts, and so maybe that's where the additional troop support could come from, as opposed to the broader AU, and maybe it could be under an UN-AU mandate with Nigerian troops in the lead, but having additional support from troops who have been involved in asymmetrical warfare.
That would be a very
so that's a possibility. They've had a lot of exercises together as ECOWAS, and that's a possibility. In terms of who you should meet, certainly you need to meet people in the security services. That would include the military, the police, and their equivalent of the CIA, basically. And I think you'll get a sense from them of where they think their challenges are, and you can hear what they say, and then you can hear what our trainers are saying, or our assistants, or those that are there to help on the U.S. assistant packages, and see where those things meet. And maybe there's still gaps, but I know that our team there is doing a top-notch job. They've always have. But I do think that those are key. Then I would also include the Justice Ministry in that as well. Because you want to make sure that everything possible on the justice and non-impunity side is being done as much as possible. So I would add that to it. And I lastly want to just say, both Muslims and Christians have been killed in this conflict, and I'd like to see us always talk about this conflict in that context. If you go back to what Shekau said a couple of years ago about trying to have an Islamic caliphate in northern Nigeria, and really starting in the region where the state of emergency is. If you look at one of those states in particular, Adamawa, it used to be about 50% Muslim and 50% Christian. The idea is to make Christians so fearful that they move out of the region. And I think that, you know, we can't add our voice to that kind of dynamic. So we need to be very careful about making sure that we're talking about this as both Christians and Muslims, particularly moderate Muslims, being under siege there. But their goal to have an Islamic caliphate means that they don't want anybody who is not Muslim in the north. And they don't want, that means that includes moderate Muslims as well. So I think we just have to be really careful that when we talk about the devastation and the killing and the abuses and the brutality, everyone who is not part of Boko Haram is subject to that.
And what I would say is, I asked Mr. Miller to finish my questioning. What I would say is that the idea behind the ceasefire, however it may be expressed here at the table, was really to focus on the idea of the populations, the Christian and Muslim populations, who equally have been victimized, to actually see if they could be the solvers of this ongoing crisis. But what I would say is that is a very good point. It is a point that I pursued and will be pursuing as well. Yes?
I had one more thing to add on the ceasefire issue, and unfortunately, I'm going to end up in the pessimist column on this. Because I said earlier that I think this is about a class of civilizations in terms of how Boko Haram sees the world.
Yes.
I think I do not see them agreeing to a ceasefire. And I think that we have to keep that in mind as we look at strategic planning and how to address this conflict. I said earlier that we need to eliminate the current playbooks here and come up with a new playbook to address this threat. But if you're talking about, and you're hearing what Shekaru Askerly is saying, and those that are following him are saying, these are not people that you're going to be able to reason with for a ceasefire, and I hate to say that, but I think we need to keep that in mind. Certainly we can make the effort and the approaches, because I agree with you, we've got to do everything possible, but I also think we have to be realistic and also look at the possibility that they're not going to respond to any overtures of a ceasefire.
Well, I am so grateful that we have this hearing to hear these kinds of very pessimistic facts, but to be realistic in how we approach this. And that's my point, that we may be in an arena that is more unique than we've ever had, and we have moved heaven and earth when we hear the word al-Qaeda and its subsets. We now have maybe a subset that is growing exponentially, and my fear is that it moves throughout the continent where we are trying to work against conflicts. So Mr. John Miller, if I could finish with you on the questioning, and might I do this, Mr. Chairman, to let you know that we have some young people from the Yes Prep North Forest area, ECS Region 4, and close-up who are in this room, and I hope they're understanding that our hearing is about saving lives and having tolerance of different groups, so I welcome them here. Mr. John Miller, your take on this whole epidemic of violence, and also, why don't I let you focus on the possibility, or not the possibility, but to getting these girls back?
Okay. Well, my solution is this. I am an optimist, and I strongly believe that every effort put in that direction is worth it. When the U.S. decided to help Nigeria publicly, I do realize that a lot of Northerners welcomed the idea, although a few of them really rejected it. But when someone like President Obasanjo stepped in, we began to see some changes, because a lot of Northern leaders began to say they want ceasefire, they want to talk to Shekau and all that. So I think that one thing we can do is to encourage President Olusegun Obasanjo to go ahead with what he's doing. I think one of the aspects that complicates the matter is the fact that from information reaching us, he is not all that good with the current president. But if they can keep their personal differences aside and look at this issue as a national issue, I'm sure that Obasanjo can be able to do something about it, particularly when it comes to bringing back the girls. I also strongly believe that someone like the Reverend Jesse Jackson has earned the trust and respect of Northerners in Nigeria, and he interacts with a lot of them, and the leaders of the northern part of the country play a big role. If these individuals are made to understand the reality of the fact that what is going on is going to drive away the development, It's going to cause a lot of chaos in the country. Certainly, they will be willing to work with individuals to bring an end to it. So I will recommend strongly that if it's possible, people like Obasanjo and Reverend Jackson should be saddled with that responsibility to at least help to look into the issue. If some people might argue that it is like giving Shakau that moral authority that he is an individual, but the fact remains that, like I stated earlier, if adequate diplomacy is not used, he will not release those girls, and any attempt to use force, he will kill them. So I would strongly suggest that people like Obasanjo and Reverend Jackson should be looked into to possibly initiate that. I have also met with them, discussed it with them, and they are very optimistic that if given the support and mandate, they can be able to really make a dent or make a headway. So I would want us to look at that.
Mr. Chairman, as I close, let me thank you very much and thank the witnesses. I know that there's more that I could have garnered from this, but I do want to say this on the record. I am pleased of the efforts that the United States and the President Obama have taken, and I know that they are there to do more, particularly with the intelligence effort, the strategic persons that were on the ground, the ability to use the intelligence gathered to help with the finding of the girls. I glean from your statements, Mr. John Miller, that emissaries, we've done it before, Mr. Chairman, so I'm going to put everything on the table that we raise with Nigeria, we raise with the United States, we raise with the United Nations, just as there's an envoy to, was an envoy to Darfur, there was an envoy to or is one to South Sudan, and we know that those issues are still boiling, that we may need to do the envoy in this instance. And I also think, Ambassador, the ECOWAS is a great team. They have been successful in the past, maybe with the embrace, as you said, of the African Union and the United Nations. So I'm throwing my hands up, Mr. Chairman, but I'm not giving up. I am frankly believing that we have to keep this on a front burner to save lives, and I would ask if they can hear my voice for the people of Nigeria in the northern area to know that they are not abandoned, and that there are those of us that feel the pain and certainly can't equal their pain of loss of life, children, husbands, wives, and other family members, or the loss of these girls, but we feel the pain, and I'm just committed to trying and helping as much as I can. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership, and I thank Congresswoman Bass and for her great leadership on this issue and your kindness of allowing me this time on the committee. I
thank my good friend from Texas for being a vital part of this hearing, and look forward to hearing of her upcoming travel. Thank you so much. Let me just conclude with a few final questions. I know you've been very, very patient with your time, and the subcommittee deeply appreciates it. Ambassador Sanders, again, I think it's worth reiterating, you testified ominously that Nigeria is at the beginning of a long war conflict, and that they have to realize this. It's no longer a localized conflict or insurgency. There's no easy fix or response, and I think that sobering analysis needs to be fully understood and appreciated by everyone. You also talk about that there needs to be regrouping, reapproach, and readdress in order to get off their heels, that's to say the Nigerian security forces who are on defense and go on aggressive offense. And I think we need to put exclamation points behind that, and that's why that training, more rather than less, and acceptance by the Nigerians that there is a special skill set that needs to be imparted that has been learned through the hard way through our military, and of course there are others involved in this as well. So thank you for bringing that sobering analysis to the committee. You've also pointed out about the trauma issue, and again, Ms. Ogebe brought several traumatized victims, moms, dads, that young girl who was one of the lucky ones who escaped Chibok, and noting parenthetically, and I think everybody knows this, but the Boko Haram troops were wearing uniforms. They looked like they were the military. That's why the young girls, in a very orderly fashion, got into the vehicles. They thought it was the military. It was not, of course. It was terrorists. But the trauma counseling that you called for, I think, is extraordinarily important. Years ago, I wrote the Torture Victims Relief Act, which deals with those who have suffered trauma from torture and I did serve as chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee for a number of years, and I served on the committee for a quarter of a century. PTSD is such a significant mental health issue, and it would seem to me that these individual girls, those who have been abducted, and all those involved who have been victimized, there needs to be much more done. Mr. Ogebe, you've talked about the Victims' Compensation Fund, and I do hope that President Goodluck Jonathan is listening and his staff put those resources towards the families, get them the kind of help, particularly psychologically, that they are so much in need of. Otherwise, that trauma embeds, it goes deeper, it acts out in many, many ways. We learned that especially with our Vietnam veterans, when 10 years, 15 years down the line, huge problems manifested, and people who weren't aware of PTSD didn't have a clue, and that includes wives and husbands and families. I think your idea, Madam Ambassador, about President Jonathan meeting with the families, invite them to the villa, have a meeting with them, and put his arms around them and say, we care for you, because, you know, with the election coming up, one of my takeaways from 4 days on the ground last week was that the election is serving as an acceleration phase for more terrorism. No ebb tide. They will get worse, not better. And as you pointed out, several of you pointed out, the ability to bring bombs into Abuja itself and to breach the security perimeter is very real, as witnessed by the attack on the bus station just very recently. Let me also point out, and I think it's worth bearing, when Greg Simpkins and I were there last September, we did meet with folks involved with the President Jonathan's Presidential Committee on Dialogue and Peaceful Resolution, which was reaching out to Boko Haram, but it was a bridge to nowhere. Maybe hope springs eternal. There might be something, but I would share your thoughts, Madam Ambassador. We're dealing with Joseph Kony. We're dealing with Charles Taylor, Slobodan Milosevic. We're dealing with bloodthirsty people who have been enabled and ennobled, not ennobled, empowered to do more rather than less killing. So,
would the gentleman yield for just one moment?
Sure.
I just want to say this. You've captured just the essence of the vitality of this hearing, and I want to add to what you're saying about the President. No one person can single-handedly fight Boko Haram, but there are things that can be done. And to my knowledge, there's no victims fund established, relief fund, that has been set up by the Nigerian government for the victims who have lost people. I don't know what the status of these girls' families, but if they are mourning and are at a central point, just as the families of the Malaysian flight, they've left their home, they're at a point, they're in need not only of the warm expression of concern, but so I would like to just make sure I put on the record that I hope, Mr. Chairman, maybe we can write a joint letter with your committee that we want a victims relief fund set up for this crisis that is ongoing by the Nigerian government. And I think it is key that we do so. And I
appreciate that. Well, I have raised it. Mr. Ogebe has raised it repeatedly. I do hope, I know the personnel from the Nigerian embassy are here. The ambassador was here earlier. It seems to me this is something that can be done very easily, because those families are left to fend for themselves. And as you mentioned, Madam Ambassador, the possibility, hopefully not the probability, but the possibility of being re-abducted remains very real. I mean, Boko Haram is capable. And so please, if you could respond. And then we'll,
I just wanted to add one more thing on the trauma and grief. I had it briefly in my statement, but I feel like I need to reiterate it. The PTSD also for the military. And I say that because I heard that a lot from some of the rank and file service members that I saw. Poor troop rotation in the area is one reason. So if when we're looking at trauma and grief counseling, you know, hopefully in our package, we're also looking at that for the Nigerian military, because I'm hearing more and more about PTSD for them as well that have served in the Northeast. So I just wanted to add that to the mix.
And if I could add, and again, having served on Veterans Affairs Committee for a quarter of a century, the Veterans Administration, notwithstanding the problems that are facing it now in terms of waiting lists, has literally written the book on how to deal with PTSD. So perhaps our own VA might be of some assistance in dealing with those thorny issues of deep psychological injury that is military as well as victims suffer. Would anyone like to say anything before we conclude this? Professor Pham.
I just want to make two brief observations, Mr. Chairman. One is with regard to, I agree with Ambassador Sanders on, realistically, on our hopes for Boko Haram has not shown itself a respecter of persons. Even the traditional authorities are well respected in Nigeria. They've threatened the Sultan of Sokoto. They've attacked the brother of the Shehu of Borno. These are traditional figures that enjoy great moral suasion, and so I hope for the best, but I join Ambassador Sanders in not being particularly sanguine about the prospects. The other point I want to make is that Congresswoman Jackson-Lee made an excellent point, the Pan-African dimension of this. A lot of the tactics that we've just discussed in the last few minutes are African tactics that they've learned from other places. AQIM in its previous incarnation as the GSPC, and even before that as the GIA, the idea of wearing uniforms and using the uniform of the military is something they perfected to an art, and they still use in Algeria, and that Boko Haram has picked up. The idea of submitting, as Mr. Agebe brought up, submitting to training as a way of outsourcing, if you will, in a very perverse way, the training of your own fighters. We saw that year in and year out in Somalia when Klan and even Shabab militia would enroll with the former transitional federal government, receive the training, take the uniform and weapons, and then move en masse right back to firing those weapons back at the people that trained them. Again, they've had these connections, they're picking these things up. These ideas move very rapidly across frontiers, and this is why Boko Haram is even now more of a danger than it has, because the means of communication that facilitate our getting information also facilitates them getting information and exchanging, if you will, best practices.
One last thing, and it's really on the heels of what Dr. Pham just said, and it's a perspective I have coming out of the diplomatic corps in terms of how we share information, and maybe there are things that we need to pay attention to. These groups do learn from each other. When I looked at the Westgate situation, I thought that they had learned from the Boston Marathon bombers because they brought in a change of clothes so that some of them could actually leave the mall with civilian clothes on, or a change of clothes. They're harder to identify. I think what Boko Haram has learned from Westgate is the separation of the hostages and moving them around. And I think that we have to pay attention to what we're saying out there and what we're sharing out there so that we don't add to the arsenal of things that they use to further impose violence and brutality on civilian populations. So I would add that I agree wholeheartedly with my colleagues on the panel and everything they've said, but particularly on this issue, I think we need to pay attention to the fact that they are paying attention to what we say and what we do and what we share. And they capitalize on that, and then they use it in the brutal way that we've seen here in the case of Nigeria.
Thank you. Emmanuel?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I agree with what Ambassador Sanders has said. There's a lot more that one would have wanted to share, but I have put it in my paper so that we don't provide fodder to the terrorists who clearly are paying a lot of attention to all that is being said. I do want to quickly mention two things. The first is with regard to the fact that last week we met with a Muslim father who has two daughters who are missing, and a Christian father who has one daughter. They traveled 2 days together to come to Abuja to meet with us. And there's something about the pain and the travesty of this experience that is making these people bond together. And as the ambassador said earlier, hopefully we can seize the moment and help unite these communities so that they can turn on the terrorists that have devastated their lives. And so part of what we as nonprofits plan to do is to continue to encourage the young girls with scholarships and so on and so forth. And these are some of the initiatives that we're working on stealthily because of the sensitivity of the subject matter. The last thing I want to say is I want to use this opportunity, and Mr. Chairman, you will forgive me for my abuse here, but I want to pay tribute to my mother, who was a northern Nigerian schoolgirl who cried in school when her teacher said that girls don't read science, they only read arts. And she insisted that she wanted to be a doctor, and they finally put her in the boys' school because boys were taught science. And she became the first female doctor from northern Nigeria. And I want to pay tribute to other young girls today, including those in captivity, who want to have that same opportunity that my mom had. And I thank you for the opportunity to say that today.
Thank you so very much for your testimonies. Very, very incisive. Hopefully, we can take this and obviously work with the administration, work with other members of Congress and the Senate to do far more than we've done. I do want to thank Embassy Abuja, including our DCM and the two human rights, Helena and Michelle. I'll go with just first names today, and Maria, for their wonderful work, their professionalism. They were very helpful during my 4 days on the ground, and we will continue working with them. And without objection, testimony from the International USCIRF, the United States Commission on Religious Freedom, Mr. Nasser, will be made a part of the record. And again, I thank you for your testimony, and the hearing is adjourned.